Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Desk University, another session with four amazing people. I'm really excited to be hearing a little bit from this group about open source in the AEC industry. I'm personally very invested in this session because the people that are be presenting are very dear to me and have really transformed our industry. As you can see above me, we have Jared. He's going to be guest hosting today's session. And so I'll turn it over to him in just a minute. But before I do, I just want to go through a couple of things. First of all, don't forget to tune in next week. Dimitri from Speckle's on the show today, but we're going to be learning a lot more about Speckle next week with an architect, an engineer, and the Speckle team. I think I'm really excited to see that as well. Don't forget to check out other videos on our stream and hit the subscribe button. And if you like something today, definitely hit the like button because as we all talk about algorithms, the YouTube algorithm also really helps us. So if you could do that, that would be great. I see so many great people, 38 people already watching this live, and that's great. Definitely say hi in the chat. The guys are watching that. Jared's watching that, and he'll be feeding your questions to the crowd and they're yeah everyone's seeing that. So with that, again, welcome to Guy, Dimitri, and Ehsan and Jared. Take it away.
Thanks, Timon. Welcome everyone. Great to see some familiar people in the chat as usual, and some new people as well. And that's kind of where I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go to kind of help feed questions to our panelists. But just to start, so we'll be talking to Ehsan, Dimitri, and Guy today about open source for AEC. The title is pretty self-explanatory, but we have each of these guys has done some incredible work in building some different open source tools for the industry that many of us are probably aware of. So we'll just be kind of talking a little bit generally about how they approach these projects, how the industry as a whole can kind of improve ourselves as contributors to these projects and whatnot. So I will kind of give first just a brief intro to the three panelists. So first we have Dimitri Stefanescu. Dimitri began developing Speckle in 2015 as part of his research as a Marie Curie PhD fellow at UCL, sponsored by InnoChain, a Horizon 2020 EU-funded project. Earlier this year, he, along with Matteo Comenetti, who we'll hear from next week, as Timon mentioned, developed a company exclusively devoted to developing Speckle and maintaining it as an open source project. Next, we have Ehsan Iranejad. Ehsan, like many of you out there, is a tinkerer and maker. Curiosity is his power, and making things better his purpose. With many years of experience as an architect designing spaces, he now spends his time getting better at architecting software at McNeil. His main focus is supporting the integration of the Rhino Grasshopper ecosystem into Revit. He's also the creator of PyRevit, another open source project, which is a rapid application prototyping environment for Revit that allows users to write their own add-ins using Python, C#, or VB. And it's obviously a project that, for people who have been following along in past streams, has come up quite a bit. And Ehsan had also given a great presentation kind of in the previous semester as well. And last but not least, we have Guy Tallarico. Guy is a former architectural designer and currently a software engineer at Airbnb. Previously, Guy worked at WeWork as a design technology and full stack as a design technologist and full stack developer, which is also where he pretty much taught me most of what I know about Python and PyRevit. He is actively involved in several free and open source projects, including Revit API Docs, APIdocs.co, Airtable Python wrapper, Iron Python stubs, AEC startups, and more recently, AEC.works. I recommend checking out his GitHub page for kind of following the latest on each of those projects. And he's also the owner of a very cute dog named Noodles, who you can follow on Instagram at we_love_noodles. And I highly recommend checking that out as well. So with that said, I guess if any of the panelists, before we kind of jump into the discussion, if you wanted to show any, just go through the website of the projects that you've worked on, you don't have to, but I don't know if Guy, if you wanted to show the AEC.works, or Ehsan, if you wanted to hop into like PyRevit or Rhino Inside or anything like that. Feel free to share your screens.
Yeah, anyone. Dimitri, you want to start? Or Guy?
Oh, Dimitri, you're on mute.
Yes, I was just saying that I'm not prepared at all for this one. I just put the website up, so you go ahead first, please.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead quickly. You should be able to see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is there are two projects that I'm involved with actively. One is the PyRabbit project that I've been maintaining for about 6 years now. This is the wiki.pyrabbit.labs.io is the wiki page to PyRabbit. You'll get, if there's everything listed in here about PyRabbit. So if you want to know about it, you want to use it, you want to develop for it, this is where sort of like the landing page is, and that's the home for PyRabbit. There's a link to the repository on GitHub if you want to ever contribute to the code. The project that I'm active at right now is the Rhino inside Revit as part of the my job at McNeil. The website is rhino3d.com inside Revit, and it'll take you to the beta version of the wiki for this software. You'll need the Rhino beta to get it to work, but you can use it with an active license of Rhino that you have. There's lots of information about this, how to get started. There's lots of guides on how to deal with Revit. And generally, this is what it looks like. This is the most exciting part of it, which is the Grasshopper integration with Revit, with lots of tools that we have created and components that are Revit aware and help you create, query, delete, modify, and basically whatever you want to do inside the Revit environment. That was all for me.
Cool, thank you. That's great.
Oh, I'll jump on a little bit. Yeah, so just flash through a couple tabs here. So yeah, Revit API Docs. It was actually one of the first websites I've made. I think in 2015, and it was essentially a summer kind of learning project. I was just trying to figure out something to do to kind of practice writing code. And then this is kind of what it came out. There's been multiple iterations, so it's changed over the years. And then later on, I decided to rebuild it from scratch. As anyone who's written code, they usually look at their own code from 2 years ago, and they're like, gross. And you just want to throw it all away and start again. It's of course, you own the project, you can do that anytime. So it's a really great opportunity. I then worked on APIdocs.co, which was essentially applying a lot of the new kind of technologies and things that I've learned to kind of rebuild the same thing, make it more scalable, bigger, a little bit easier to kind of write, to maintain. Both of them are still alive. And then some of the other smaller projects, I have a Python client for Airtable that's fairly popular. Basically just makes it easier if you're writing any integrations with Airtable in Python. It's fairly popular, it gets over 100,000 installs a month, but basically a really easy way to write Python code that talks to Airtable. And then other smaller projects like this. More recently, I've been spending some time on kind of trying to understand and kind of track the industry, especially as a lot of new companies come up. So I started this, I think, about a year ago. It was initially an Airtable. Actually, it is an Airtable. And then there's just a little front end that kind of renders a list of companies that I think are kind of excited in the AC space. And then more recently, I've been working on this project called AEC.works. I've decided to do things a little bit differently. So this project has been kind of open source from day one. And I'm working with a few other people on this. So we have a team of about 4 or 5 people that have been actively contributing to this. So it's pretty exciting. Hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit more about this during the conversation. But this is sort of a version 2 of AC startups. So there's just kind of a list of companies that are curated in kind of the AC space. So this is meant to be fully open source, not only the code, but also the content. So people can kind of add and modify. Things are still a little bit locked right now. Would encourage people to take a look. This is not really like formally announced and released, so there's lots of bugs and there's fake content. But we're going to be releasing a more formal kind of strategy moving forward on how we're going to be working on developing this and kind of open it up for people to contribute both ideas as well as code. That's it for me.
Sweet.
Thanks.
I just opened a couple of tabs as well, so I can run through using Guy's technique. So just a quick overview about what Speckle is. I must say, Guy, like probably half of the hits you're getting on your API docs were from us when we were developing the Revit connector, just so you know. Basically, Speckle is been introduced already as a project. It's quite, accumulating a bunch of years already behind it. That doesn't necessarily equate to experience, but anyway, how we kind of like see ourselves is pretty much as kind of the open source data platform for AEC. You can find out more about it on speckle.systems and on our Twitter account, of course. There's a bunch of things that Speckle does that I will let you explore. Pretty much one of the basic features that we solve is, or try and solve, is interoperability. So we've got a bunch of clients for Grasshopper, Revit, Rhino, GSA, structural analysis software that help you kind of shuttle data from one software to another. The nice part is, and I guess why I'm sitting on, on this panel, is because everything's open source. So this has been quite a big leap of faith for us. But this kind of actually generated a lot of kind of value, I guess. We'll discuss this later. You can see pretty much all the code on Speckle in our GitHub organization. Now, mind you, we're in a bit of a transition stage where we're kind of pushing out the 2.0 part, like exactly like how Guy said. We took a step back. We looked at kind of the pile of messy spaghetti that we had in the past. And we decided to, it's time for a revamp. So do check it out, github.com/speckle.systems. And for more information as well, like discourse.speckle.works is where kind of we're hanging out with our Speckle users and discussing Speckle 2.0 and so on and so forth. That's pretty much it from me. So
Great. Thank you guys for sharing those links. So with that, we'll kind of jump into the discussion. Before kind of jumping straight into the questions, I kind of just wanted to mention, like, given the nature of Your Desk University as kind of this open, I wouldn't call it necessarily open source project, but as it's open free platform for anyone to join in, and obviously given the types of projects that you guys are all just presented a little bit on, I think like the discussion as a whole, I don't think we need to kind of like have that discussion of like whether open source is good or bad for the industry. I think we all probably agree on that, that it's a good thing, and so I think the discussion that we'll be having, I think, will focus more on like the how we get better and how you know, the different approaches to open source projects that you guys have taken, because each of you kind of have, there's kind of like on the, as Dimitri just presented, there's kind of a kind of almost like more of a business built on top of this project, which is very different than, say, kind of some of the smaller tools and like website kind of stuff that Guy has been doing, which is more just kind of stuff that I know he does for fun usually to start, and it's kind of like these crazy side projects that he has, which are all awesome. And then there's kind of somewhere maybe in the middle or maybe on its own is kind of the examples of like PyRevit and Rhino Inside, which are also open source platforms that are kind of like pseudo. I mean, Rhino Inside is more closely associated with more of the business side, whereas like PyRevit is kind of just more of a free open source tool that Ehsan's been very generous with his time and efforts on over the past few years. So we kind of have like a very different angles at which you guys have kind of approached it. So I think that should help kind of with the discussion. So with that said, I guess the first question I have for you guys is, how does the AEC community, as a community with few people who are formally trained as programmers, become better at contributing to open source projects? And kind of what I mean by that specifically is, not just, there is obviously the short answer is become better programmers, but I think there's an answer that I'm kind of digging for here that it has more to do with kind of the, like how we shift our kind of culture around these types of projects. So I'll let whoever wants to take that one first go for it.
yeah, I think, for example, you mentioned the key aspect there, like culture. I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers that we've found so far. in the sense that what we found through Speckle maybe, and through my experience, is that maybe sometimes incentives are not necessarily aligned. So there's a lot of kind of AEC companies that treasure their kind of internal development and they're not sharing it back, right? And I think the only way to break this barrier is a bit by you just, let's say, YOLOing around and just throwing your stuff out there, pretty much like all three of us have been doing. That's one thing, but also like, for example, Guy and, AEC.works, the effort that he's putting into actually organizing a community around that and trying to build contributors and a solid contribution platform there, it's not trivial, right? So that's it. I plugged Guy in now, so I think it's.
I think the incentives point it's particularly interesting to me. I think there is, as a contrast, I always think it's interesting to look at the software technology industry and see how things are differently. I think there's a lot of incentives. As a contrast, I always think it's interesting to look at open source projects where technology people may choose a job over the other because they have an opportunity to work on open source project. Ehsan, I think, is a good example of that, and Image as well. And I think in the within AEC, there's not a huge amount of software engineering roles. It's not like people are advertising these types of roles. They're very, very unique. It's very rare that someone can go work at an architecture company and be full time dedicated to like writing open source. So there's a question of incentives, and then also I have like a personal kind of story where when I was still in architecture, and I won't name companies, but I was working on kind of building tool and very high level things like on top of whatever Grasshopper or it wasn't PyRevit back then, but I was interested in sharing those things out. We had like a forum on the Grasshopper website, and I wanted to make it open, and they basically they wouldn't let us because they thought somehow it contained some sort of secret recipe that no one could know about. So there's this kind of industry version, I guess, to like sharing things, because somehow it's going to become a competitive advantage to or they're going to lose some competitive advantage. And for some reason, the technology industry, you don't see that. It's generally the opposite. Companies will take something they've spent years and years on and make it open source. I think it's unclear to me, like all the ways in which they benefit and how that decision is made. How a company like Facebook will open source React or many of these other like major open source projects that came from companies. I think they get back in the sense that the project grows, the benefit that it gives and the way it attracts talent, because they know they can work on that, and how it also develops like an ecosystem like around the industry of people that know this technology. And I think a lot of these incentives are not present in this industry. I'm not quite sure why, I guess, but I do see that kind of lack in some of those incentives.
Sorry. I guess I don't know. I don't really have anything else to add to Guy and Dimitri. That is always been the case for me, that whenever you want to change culture, it takes time, and you kind of have to, like people like us developers and then the users who would really like these products, and they sort of like want to support them in any way, whether they're financially supported, they're supported with their programming, anything like that. This continuous push for improving better tools is the one that eventually will hopefully change the culture.
Yeah, I mean, what I appreciate a lot about McNeil is kind of their openness in this, and the kind of their willingness to participate in open source, which is something that you don't see much. And it's also kind of like what Guy mentioned before, or like, like the community building part, like, right, you're investing a lot in that at McNeil, which is, but not in a superficial way. I mean, now that we're on Your Desk University rather than Autodesk University, we can say that it's kind of a not marketing driven necessarily effort, right? It's more of an effort to respond to user needs, right?
Exactly. That's actually like the first day that I talked to Bob McNeil, that's sort of like, as far as I know, that's his sort of like worldview and the culture that he has created at McNeil. That we're not in the business of developing software. We're in the business of solving our customers' problems. Like you got to figure out what they're looking for and what the challenges that they're trying to solve, and you support them, in whichever directions they want to go. And eventually, of course, as a company, you kind of have to be able to, make decisions for like in which directions you want to take your product towards and all that kind of stuff. But still, it's the community that matters the most. And I think the AEC industry has a long way to kind of learn that trust is not
Totally.
the business. The business advantage is not the technology that you have on your computers. It's the trust of the customers and the people that are actually buying products and services from you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to continue this a bit, like in Arab, my previous employer, they sponsored Speckle pretty much for 2 years, the development thereof, through essentially employing me and Matteo. They were kind of slowly shifting towards this view, but it was a big kind of change ultimately, right? You could see it pretty much like what Guy said before that. There's a lot of AEC companies that like don't see things like this, right? There's suddenly some nice little happy hacker wearing up 3 components in Grasshopper, and that becomes like kind of competitive advantage suddenly. Whereas it's actually I wouldn't call it a silly script, but anyway, sorry, I'll stop ranting.
Yeah, no, I want to add a point that I guess it turns into a little bit more of a call to action as far as like how can things change. And I think there's a few examples out in the industry where people can promote that change by basically kind of doing it by example, and also by
Totally.
convincing firms that they need to do that in order to retain talent. And I'll give a couple examples, but I think in particular, like Andrew Human, who I know well from working with him, and we work both at NBBJ and at Woods Bagot, was kind of able to work on tools and make them open source. I think I don't know the details, so I'm like speculating here a little bit. I haven't actually asked him the particulars of that, but if you take someone like him who's very talented, who obviously likes to to work in this kind of fashion, you can see that a company can use that as almost like as a hook and as additional benefits that it can give the person. Like, yeah, sure, we'll let you do this. And I think people that are able to build tools like that, they can kind of use that to help kind of nudge and push companies a little bit. I mean, I think Ehsan as well, you're not, actually both of you guys are examples where you're able to get your company to kind of sponsor you. And I think it's unclear how much it benefit the company directly, or basically how they use that as a way to like keep you in, and they know that by giving you that, they're able to maintain, kind of like a talent powerhouse by, basically, allowing you to do that almost like as a benefit, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is like the exact question I wanted to kind of get at is what is, there is kind of like Guy was talking about with software companies, there's kind of more that incentive in terms of recruitment of talent and things like that. But when it comes, when there's an open source platform that's kind of put out there by a company, other AEC companies might look at that and be a little bit hesitant to use it because it's like, oh, we're gonna like end up kind of helping out this company kind of thing. And so I guess how do you navigate that? And because Guy, I thought like the example of like Andrew Human, who made who's made a lot of great tools, like people don't necessarily, unless you're like really involved like deeply in following him very closely, like you wouldn't necessarily know that that was something that he developed at NBBJ or something like that. So like you associate the tool with him, and so like what? Yeah, I think I think that's a great question. Is like what you're getting at right now is what is there is kind of like this almost this need to separate it from the company to a certain extent to get other people to use it. I guess what are other people's thoughts on that?
I don't know where to start, but definitely yes, right. I mean, this is part of the big reason why we established the company around Speckle. It's actually Speckle as a kind of as a story, I spun it out of research at UCL, so to say, and then kind of spun into Arup as they were using it already, and then we decided to spin out as well together with Matteo, because mostly we saw there's a huge need of for what we're doing out there, and then we were risking quite a bit in kind of being associated with a essentially AEC powerhouse, right? So there's a lot of kind of suspicion and kind of this, whose competitive advantage is better or bigger, so to say, just to put it in a very stupid way. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, contributing and doing an open source project, it's definitely kind of the most satisfactory thing I've ever done in my life, right? It's like the amount of kind of satisfaction you get from interacting with the people that gather around these projects and with kind of essentially your impact in the industry is not comparable to, let's say, if you would keep your tool in-house, for example. So there's that on my end.
One of the things that I looked at last year, and sort of like, again, tying it to the previous question about how we can push the industry forward. One of the things that I looked at was that I believe that in AEC as an industry could really benefit from a co-op organization that sort of like the model would be a series of companies joining and paying towards being included in a team, sort of like managed by that co-op. Everything's open source. It's a nonprofit. They get to benefit all the tools that they're making, and it sort of like ties into this brotherhood kind of culture that the AEC understands. So they get to team up with a couple of other companies to do something. There's incentive for them to still get benefit from the sort of like the publicity and everything else around it with the tools that they create. But also once this beast is out, then you can't really stop it. Then more and more companies are going to join, and sort of like you see more of these co-ops show up. And that was my hope, that such a movement would actually sort of like push the industry forward in a better way. I don't know. There have been other examples of this sort of like structure happened before, and I don't know how successful they've been. But this is the model that I was really looking at to see if I can attract other developers that are working at other companies to be able to be part of the Pirate project. That was my way of sort of like trying to figure out if I can bring talent to the open source project. Other than that, my experience has always been with the rest of the open source project that still you don't get to pick and choose. People usually come to your software and they want to contribute because they're excited. You don't get to pick and choose them based on their like programming experiences and all that kind of stuff. My experience has been that a Wikipedia and a certain set of standards and sort of like goals for the project has been the most helpful on many of the open source projects that I've looked at. That's sort of like the community has a guideline that, hey, this is the quality of the work that we want. These are the resources that you might need to sort of like, get yourself up to speed to how we work in this open source project and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is by far one of its more powerful things about open source, that you get people from all walks of life and all the different use cases that they bring to your software, and that pulls it into many different directions and hopefully land somewhere that's like super useful for everybody.
True.
I think this idea of some sort of co-op or kind of coordination between firms to develop something sounds, it's really amazing. There's a couple of instances of things like that in the software industry, either like different types of consortiums that get together to define standards, or something like Apache. I don't actually know who founds them, but who basically like invests in open source projects that end up basically being useful to kind of all of the industry members. But yeah, as far as I know, there's nothing like that in the industry.
I'm just gonna like add one data point here, right? So with Speckle, I tried from kind of like back in the research times to essentially establish some sort of like foundation around it. Like non-profit organization of sorts that would kind of shepherd the project and guide it through and so on and so forth. And why we gave up, or why I gave up on this idea, is mostly because of the management overhead. Right. So from what Ehsan was saying, essentially like the interactions that you cherish in open source are very meritocratic and based on essentially like simple, you can contribute, your contributions are helpful. If you want to upskill yourself, you provide a friendly way to do that and guidance if you have the time to do so. What I found in the interactions and then like endless discussions around kind of foundations and co-ops and so on, there's always kind of you always end up having essentially two communities. The one that can pay into this foundation, right? Which membership fees are not, they're like something like $20,000 a year or more. For like a medium organization, they can go even higher. And then you end up with a situation a bit like Building Smart, right? It's a pay for play game, with the added caveat that you as an open source maintainer, you have so much bureaucratic crap to deal with before you end up actually writing some code. That this was our experience on this route, right? It's not necessarily the way forward, and it's true that I would be happy to support in the future such an adventure, right?
Yeah. When I was kind of researching this co-op the topic, I talked to a company called Tidelift. Yeah. I really like their model of, hey, these are the open source projects that we always use, but there's so much dependencies on these open source projects. You don't know what's maintained, what's not. We'll take care of that part. We'll provide you a good set of a tool chain of like all these open source projects that are maintained. We guarantee some level of whatever. And I was thinking like this could also be one of the ways of this co-op would work. Like a lot of companies could have developed tools in house. A lot of times the developer that actually develops those tools in-house leaves the company, and they sort of like stuck with whatever the scripts that the guy wrote for AutoCAD like 10 years ago. So this, like, one of the tasks for this co-op, one of the benefits of being part of this co-op could be that, hey, bring all the existing tools that we have and we'll maintain them for you. That kind of a situation. It's a lot of work and whatnot, but it gets the community, it provides projects for the community and some sort of like form of a development, and everybody else also gets the benefit from it.
Yeah, I like Tidelift, and I like their tagline that they're trying to essentially fix open source, essentially by trying to fund it, right? And I find it amazing. I'm not sure, like, because I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. I think I don't know.
Yeah, I guess quickly on that topic, we did have like there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'm not going to get to all of them, but there was what one person had mentioned, can universities be a way at open source and the AEC industry, like to open source the AEC industry? And I know like Dimitri, a lot of Speckle was kind of developed as a within an academic setting. Like, do you see, and I think that's probably more common in Europe, that there's probably a closer association between the industry and academia. And do you think that's like a successful or a step in the right direction, or do you think it's maybe a little bit too distant from reality?
So the disclaimer here is that usually I'm a very jaded and skeptical person. So like, take what I'm gonna say with a pinch of salt. Usually, my experience is that academic code is kind of, write once, run once, and burn. That's kind of the end of it. In principle, definitely yes. And I think InnoChain was a successful example of this because it produced, amongst other things, it produced Speckle, right? It essentially gave me a generous salary for 3 years to do research in whatever direction I wanted. And it gave me the industry network to interact with at the level that I wanted to interact with for these 3 years, right? So that's how Speckle was born. So definitely academia can do this. Now, I just finished I just had my Viva and I had to reread my PhD thesis. And I remember like kind of all the papers and all the stuff, literature that I had to go through, and the amount of software that probably backs those papers. That software that I've never seen for various reasons, that doesn't really exist in the public eye, that was never released, that I couldn't build on top of, even if I wanted to. So academia is a mixed bunch, right? It depends a lot on how you set it up, but definitely I think it's a bit easier to align incentives there because there's less of the, competitive advantage pressure. Right.
Great, great. I think maybe just to kind of move on to some other topics. I think I saw like somebody had mentioned, actually Guy, it was you. You just mentioned in the chat like the Ladybug tools, which kind of is a segue into the idea of like curation of the community. I think I know we had Mustafa was in one of our talks from the last semester, had kind of mentioned that he has kind of like desire for the community to be better users, and almost like have a test before you can actually use his tools. I'm kind of just curious to get some of your thoughts on how we get more informed user, or if that's even like a concern of yours. Like, do you just, as far as the users, do you have do you care necessarily who the users are, or do you just kind of want to like put it out there and say like, whatever people want to do with this, go all out?
I'll say I know exactly where Mustafa's coming from, right? Like because having worked as an architect, we've all seen basically people using his tools as like an excuse to design something the way they want, like the traditional crazy.
I did that too.
Yeah, I did that too. We've all done it, right? And then you just make any shape.
Fudging the data.
You put a heat.
Yeah.
And then you put a heat map on it and
yeah,
say
and then
you
you
did an
say,
analysis.
and then you just twist it. So like I totally understand that. I don't know how like specific to his tool is. I mean, I've definitely never made any tool where like their misuse of it would be like impactful, where entire city skylines are basically shaped by potentially misuse of.
Because you had a bug in your Airtable wrapper.
Right. Yeah. So
the entire building is crumbling right now.
I don't have that type of responsibility. So. Yeah, I don't know. At least none of the tools that I've made have that. The stakes are not that high, I guess.
For me, it's just use it for whatever. Take it in any direction that you want to take it. The only thing that I generally say that, hey, like I might not go with you where you want to go, but
yeah,
the project is there, and that project is yours now. When you first PR gets merged into the project, that project is as much as yours as it's yours as much as it's mine. So take it in your own direction and whatnot. The only thing that I've really found helpful is not it's just have a vision for the project and say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Take it in any direction that you want, but have these guidelines in mind to guarantee some level of quality. I don't know, for example, if an open source project has the goal to be portable, portability is always a key. So whatever feature you add, make sure it's portable.
Yeah, we kind of like when I started Speckle and I like slapped an MIT license on it, like that was kind of possibly total noob approach to open source. Like, okay, it's my like 5th GitHub repo, of course, slap MIT on it, and like people will flock and help it make it better. And this is what I realized, and now at Speckle we're trying to understand, because ultimately our success is ultimately tied to the success of kind of the developers and our the people that depend on Speckle. And from that point of view, we are trying very hard to, or not trying very hard, but we're like attempting to kind of like streamline the contribution process in a kind of a more packaged format, right? And Oktoberfest is a good example here. We were not ready for it this time round, maybe next year. But we see that, if you have like kind of very nicely boxed packaged functionality of like, help wanted flagged issues, and then you also have to be aware that you have to commit time to actually whoever is jumping on these issues, like to actually help them, guide them, and solve them. That's how you build a community ultimately of contributors, right? Not of users. There's a difference there. And for us, it's very tough now because ultimately it's, the velocity of development that we have in pushing out 2.0 versus the time that we invest in kind of helping onboard contributors and kind of make our repos contribution friendly. It's quite difficult to balance this. It's like it's a bit of it's a bit of a certain, it's a tight schedule, let's say, at least. So
Yeah. I don't know. I think there's some other thing that's really important is that you always have a very unbalanced sort of like set of users that a huge amount of them just want to use the software, and only a very small subset actually want to contribute. And from them, there's actually a very smaller subset that can contribute to the project.
yeah.
Like an example would be the VLC. For VLC is open source. Yes, there's millions and millions of users around the world, but to be able to contribute to the project, you're going to have to understand the complexity of a video codec and audio codec, and be able to sort of like, it's the barrier is kind of sort of like, the learning
Right,
the
yeah.
learning curve is steep. But I think the open source projects also have this sort of like, I don't know, this should have this goal in mind that, hey, we also need to help train the community as much as we can, so that the users eventually become contributors and eventually become core developers, and then they'll be the ones who will teach the next generation of how, like, how the software works and what it's meant to be.
Totally agreed on this. Yeah.
I think this, what you mentioned, Dimitri, this idea that you make it open source and then all of a sudden magic just happens, and it's like one of the biggest fallacies. And Ehsan's point, like almost every project you look at, the magnitude is going to be something like a successful project, hundreds of thousands or like millions of users, and then maybe like a few hundred, maybe a few hundred contributors, and that includes like someone posted an issue, and then there's like 2 or 3 guys or folks that have done more contributions, and like one person who's like done the bulk of work. So like you need a really big critical mass to actually get like start to get really meaningful contributions, or like the right mix of people. But it's definitely not kind of magic just happens when you make it open source. One interesting example I've had of this, I think it's relevant to this conversation, was when I built Revit API docs. I actually had it open source for a year, and the issue was, there was a kind of a high barrier of entry, right? It's web dev. There's a front end. There's a back end. There's secrets and servers you need to manage. So it's a little bit harder than just like like it takes a lot of work to make it open source. It takes a lot of work to make it easy for people to kind of contribute. It takes a lot of work to kind of onboard, as you guys were mentioning. And then there was also the issue of kind of incentives, right? So like what happened? You make this website open source, and then what happens? It's like, okay, maybe someone will come and maybe like improve the experience or add a feature. I left it open source for a year, and that never happened. All I got was maybe like a couple issues of people like pointing out bugs, which was helpful. But I never really got any substantial, contributions. And in this specific case, I actually spent a lot of money. It cost me a couple $100s a year to like keep up the server running, the servers running, domains, cache, and all of that. So for a while, I didn't make any money. I was basically paying to run it, I think, for like 2 years. And once I basically became, I was on a visa, so I couldn't legally make any money on it. Once I was able to actually, I became a resident, and I could put ads on it, basically have a revenue stream outside of work. I put ads on it, and I started making, whatever, I think it's like $150 a month or something. It's not much. But it pays for all the servers. So then I was thinking, okay, no one is really making any meaningful contribution. What's the dynamics here? Why is it open source? I could just have an issue tracker, but at the same time, someone could now just clone this and like deploy it as Revit API docs too, and like put ads on it and like take the the revenue that I have from working on this for like several years. So there was this question of like me not really finding like the right the it shouldn't just be open source for the sake of being open source. Like there should be some incentive that you get, the project gets. And in this case, it didn't have any for a while. So I actually made it private after that. and it's just ad powered, so it's free, but not open source. Later on, for API docs, I maintained also private code, and I allowed people who sort of contributed to support the project on Patreon to have access to the source code. And that was primarily so that it could be used for sort of educational purposes, if people wanted to know how it was built, or just be able to look through the source code, but not necessarily made it fully open. Again, the amount of work it takes to be able to onboard someone to become, to make meaningful contributions on a project, it's quite steep.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, Guy, on this one. That first of all, there's always this misconception about the open source projects that they kind of like expect it to be free, but open source doesn't really mean free. A lot of really good open source projects are actually paid projects, but there's a reason you don't go into open source because you want to sort of like publish a software for free, and you want to gain a lot of like other contributors and stuff to your project. That probably, as your example, that probably not going to happen in anytime soon. You're going to open source because of a goal that you have, that hey, if I do this, this will spread the work that I've created, helping setting a standard maybe, or like eventually helping somebody that's that needs this project to be able to help to, like, there's this project that I'm working on right now, and the open source project that I've pretty much rewritten the whole code in a completely different way, but all of this new code is going to go back to the project. So it's technically is a new open source project, but it's still it provides, having that open source project there in the first place was the incentive to bring all this code back into that repo because it's already there, and you get the benefit of like the publicity and everything else around it too. So I really think you go into open source just for the open source. That there's a higher goal that you have to be in the open source. There's one thing that also Kike mentioned that I wanted to touch on, that the quality of the project is also super helpful in the amount of users amount of contributors you bring to the project. Like giving credit to Kike, his projects are to Guy, I'm sorry. His projects are very, very organized. Like I know when I'm walking into his project and looking through the code, it's not because I'm so good that I can understand what's going on. It's because he's so good that I can understand what's going on. Because the project is well organized. There's documentation. If there's something weird happened, there's comment before it that I can read and understand what's happening and whatnot. And most of the projects that are not documented this way, and they don't sort of like it's not very clear what the code is actually trying to do. It's actually damages the project in terms of like bringing contributors to it, because it's hard to read, and most developers look at that and they're like, if I want to spend that much time trying to understand what this is, I'm just going to rewrite it myself.
Yeah.
I think so. One of the things that came up in a few of your most recent comments is kind of like this idea of incentives, and we also had a question kind of related to how at one point do you kind of make that decision to like try to make a living off of an open source project versus kind of Guy, you gave the example of like with Revit API docs, it was more like, well, I'll just put some ads up in order to cover my server costs. How do you kind of like draw the threshold? I guess this is kind of a question a little bit for Dimitri in terms of like, how do you say like, I'm going to turn this into a business versus something more kind of like what Ehsan was just describing, where it's like, well, this is going to be something that's going to help me in some other regard anyway, or help someone else in some other way. So it doesn't need to be monetized necessarily.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? So I think it ties into like kind of our last conversation, right? Like you do open source because you have a vision. And I think essentially here, like kind of the vision that Speckle has is to, be a data platform that's neutral and transparent for the AEC industry and open source as well as open. And that's one of the differences there. And in order to be able to claim that you literally need to be open source, right? So, I mean, we want to provide infrastructure, right? And infrastructure needs to be open source. You can't necessarily patent a road, right? And this is a quote from MariaDB and so on and so forth. Now, the decision that we took with Speckle is to actually make a business around it. Ties into the previous discussion that we had around the kind of the co-op and stuff. So I was continuously searching for the best way to ensure the survivability of Speckle and kind of increase the buzz factor. I mean, sorry, decrease the buzz factor. I don't know. Anyway, like kind of ensure the long-term maintenance of Speckle and its kind of continued existence in time, right? And literally the single best way that I could find together with Matteo was to actually establish a full-blown for-profit company around it. If you would kind of sit within an AEC company, for example, there's compromises that you need to make. If you want to essentially go down the co-op and foundation and NGO route, there are different compromises that you need to make there in terms of management overhead and actually getting things done at the speed that you want to get them done. So pretty much that was the only way that we saw forward. So that's how we decided to actually establish a company. It's for the sake of the fucking project, excuse my French. So there's that, right? And it was a tough decision because we know it's a risky decision, but at the same time, we believe in the success of it because like how we went into this was not totally naive. We are actually, there are commercial open source projects out there, established companies that have established business patterns around there. And more importantly, they kind of have set out nice examples of how, you ask your community, what are you willing to pay for? And you have this dialogue with them. And then actually, surprisingly, you will get answers. And then out of those answers, you will be able to, run your company, pay the bills, keep the lights on, and so on and so forth. So a very good example here is GitLab. They're like big heroes of ours in a way. But yeah, it's not, there's no straight answer ultimately. The journey is tedious and it's fraught with edge cases, so to say. And probably every project needs to decide this on their own, right?
By the way, I had to look up the buzz factor. It seems like it's better when it's bigger.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Like it's getting a bit late in London, and I'm having my second glass of wine here. So like,
my word of the day is the buzz factor. Today I learned.
Okay.
That's when you don't want the person to get hit by. What happens if they get hit by a bus, right, or something?
Right. Yeah. Like exactly. How many developers, can get hit by a bus until the project is dead or something like this? Because nobody
like
else
the minimum
understands the
number
code.
of key people.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess on the opposite end of that spectrum, like Ehsan on a project like PyRevit, like what made you decide, I'm just going to keep that. This is kind of helpful. Generally, like I don't need to monetize this necessarily. I mean, people are open to donate to the project. So for people out there listening, feel free. But I guess what made you decide you probably could have turned that into a business if you really wanted to?
Spite. just kidding. No, I, for good or bad reasons, I came from a different world that had a lot of like bootleg software. Until I moved to the US, I never really paid for software. I never used software insanely in a professional capacity, so that makes me feel a little better. But when I moved here and sort of like started developing and stuff, I really understood why we need to pay for software. I'm not one of those people that think software should be free. I think a healthy healthy development environment needs companies that pay for software and they create great solutions, and needs projects that are open source and free and everything else. But the mentality behind PyRevit from the very, very first days of it was that I'm tired of the ecosystem of third-party applications and add-ons in the Revit space that charge money for miscellaneous things. And I understand that they try to fill a gap in the ecosystem, and they created solutions and they want to charge for it and all that kind of stuff. But I'm one of those people that believe that as you use, like there's a lifetime to every technology that you that you develop. If you want to benefit from it for a very, very, very long time, that we're not going to grow as like human beings. And at some point, we should drop that and spend our time doing something else, and then charge for the new technologies that we create. So when I see I don't know, like a pattern maker for Revit costs like $65 per person. To me, that's a lot of money, especially like that we had this pattern maker 10 years ago in AutoCAD, and that so that was the main reason that Pirate was always meant to be free. That hey, this is like a set of basic tools that you really shouldn't pay for. Like get these things to be able to work properly, and then go spend your money, hard-earned money, on something that's more important. That was really the thought behind Pirate, and that was also the main reason that I selected a GPL license for it. That hey, use it as much as you want. This is free as long as you contribute back and you don't wrap it in a different product and start selling that. Sort of like stay within the open source kind of like license. Um, that was really the two main goals behind it. I never now the users actually, they're very kind and they contribute back to the project financially. There's a Patreon that supports the project and whatnot, but that wasn't making money out of the project, was never a goal. It was always like, hey, get the basics of the tools. And I was the first user. Like I wanted to create those tools for myself first. That hey, I need them, and now that I need them, I can share it with somebody else outside.
Yeah, I don't have anything particular to add, but I guess I have a question for you, Hassan, which is, I mean, it's speculation, but instead of not only like, why did you decide, but do you think if you had not made it open source to begin with, the project would have been as successful as it is?
I don't
Like,
think so.
let's say, imagine if you had, whatever, 5 years ago, you
Yeah.
posted PyRevit and you said, $50 to install it. Like, where do you think the project would be today? If you had gone that
Realistically,
route?
after these many years, I think the project would have been dead, like from the start. It would have been sitting on my hard drive for a long time. It would go in all these weird directions because I never wanted to spend time because there was no incentive. It was just a bunch of scripts. I would have never talked to you. You would have never told me, hey, you don't write monolithic applications. Like break this into separate modules and stuff so other people can contribute to it. I would have never learned this much. I think I like making Pirate open source was one of the best choices that I've made, like with any software that I've created. It helped me get better. It helped the community get better, and it's just helped the company that I was working for save a lot of money, and also got me a seat at this table of cool people.
And for those of you that don't know, Ehsan and I actually GitHub friends. That's where we met. In fact, his name on my phone used to be Ehsan Github when we first exchanged phone numbers. And my wife didn't know what GitHub was. She thought that was his last name. So, little fun fact there.
Guy was the first Pirate user when I published it like online back in 2014. I think it was end of 2014, something like that. We still have his first email to me that hey, like I saw this is interesting, but it's kind of hard to let's make this better.
Well, we're at an hour now, so I don't want to go too much longer. But I guess just to kind of, if and you guys have like a last call for what you wish to see, or any last thoughts. I think some of the takeaways for me were really kind of trying to build momentum around changing the culture, and I think a lot of what you guys have obviously already been doing that, and like AEC Works potentially could become like one of those areas where we gather around and are able to come together as an industry. But I guess just maybe a few closing comments from each of you, if you want, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I'll go. I guess my call to action, I mean, it's just, if you just search, how to contribute to open source, you always get the same list, right? Which is like, it doesn't have to be code, start with documentation, start with that. And I mean, the reality is that's true. It's just a matter of kind of getting your hands on it. I do think a kind of cultural change for something like this has to be bottoms up. Like companies are not going to just decide on their own to do more open source projects. It's going to come from people who want to use open source projects and from talent that it's asking to be given the time to work on open source. So it really has to be bottoms up, and that means getting more people involved, getting more of a critical mass. So uh, part of that is just figuring out how to lower the barrier of entry and getting more people contribute. So yeah, I mean, even simple things like filing well-written issues, like that's I mean, I don't contribute to a lot of projects, but I file issues in lots of projects, and just like getting better at kind of the etiquette of open source. How do you file issues? How do you approach like a maintainer? How do you become engaged with a project? That's kind of one thing, and just do that as much as possible. There's really only benefits from that. And then the second one is to just do it more yourself. I mean, I was actually listening to an interview from an author book. It's called, I think, Working in Public. I haven't actually read the book, but I kind of take that to heart. Like almost everything I do starts with a new public repo, even when I'm not sure exactly what it's going. Even if I don't intend it for it to be some big open source project, 99% of them are not. I still think it's a good idea for people to do that. It's good practice. This idea that your code is kind of out in the open and exposed. It promotes like best practices. It lets other people, learn from it. And there's really kind of only benefits from it. So I encourage everyone to kind of do these two things, to do more on their own. And even if they're like learning, like here's my, whatever C# learning repo, just throw a repo in there and put your work. And then just get engaged in projects at any level you can. I think you'll be surprised. Most contributors are happy to help if you kind of approach them, kind of respectfully and ask for help on how to contribute. You'd be surprised how much people are willing to kind of help uplift others that are trying to contribute.
Anything to add, Dimitri or Ehsan?
I think Guy closed it very well. Nothing really for me. Maybe let's make that co-op happen.
Yeah, why not? I'm gonna then, like, on this session, I'm gonna end up like with a very kind of Marxist quote, like what was it, like from the like freedom, if it's just privilege if it's not extended or enjoyed by one and everybody. So essentially it's a bit up to us to extend and kind of distribute that freedom, as well as kind of what he said, like, come on, people, join, poke, ask questions in a nice way, please, because I think all three of us are quite tired, or all four of us are quite tired and like stretched out, but we're definitely happy to help. So, let's keep on going.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to close it out. So thank you guys all for your time and for everything that you guys have done in terms of your contributions to the movement of open source in the AEC community. And thank you everyone who's out there listening, and we'll hopefully see you in future talks.